Let me know when we're live.
All right. Can anybody hear us yet? Can anybody hear us yet?
It just showed up, so I don't know how much delay we got. Grand total 7 watching. That's exciting.
That's more than we deserve. More than we deserve.
It's low bar, man. Low bar.
All right, y'all tell us if you can hear us. All right, y'all tell us if you can hear us. I think we're live. All right. Awesome. All right. Let a few people get in. Let a few people get in. And we'll get to chatting.
I didn't realize you'd grown a nice holiday beard.
I did. I did. Mostly out of apathy. Mostly out of apathy. More than anything else.
Yeah. As always, guys, we're kind of doing this on the fly, so if you guys have questions, throw them up in the chat. I'm sure hopefully more people will come. Usually they do.
Yeah, I was telling Josh before this started. I don't.
I see what's going on. Yeah,
Let's see.
I'll get rid of the echo momentarily. It's on my end.
Sure?
I know what's going on.
Okay. Are you sure? We don't expect a ton of people to show up. We don't expect a ton of people to show up. And we haven't been doing preview shows. We are happy to stay here as long as there's people that want to chat. As long as there's people that want to chat. 16 now, so that's pretty good. 16 now. Clemson man is here, so Clemson man is here. We will start. So let's see. At SECFans actually is a tag that's going to change. Notice we're doing a little bit of a rebrand. We're doing a little bit of a College Football Nerds is what we're going to start calling ourselves. And we have a website, collegefootballnerds.com. We have merged my football data project with the NFL stat stuff that I'm sure y'all have seen. If you haven't, you should go check it out. Basically, NFLU, DVU, wide receiver U. We've got stats to show who actually can claim that title. And then most of our stuff that was on SECFans.com, which is just blog posts and a collection of things that are basically our shows and audio shows. It will be posted now on collegefootballnerds.com. We had a lot of fans outside the SEC that seemed to like us, but stayed away for a long while because they thought a bit of homers, and it took them a while to finally kind of dip their toe into what we were doing and realize that we weren't homers. Stop scaring people away. So there we go. Let's see. All right, guys, we're gonna fix the. We're gonna fix the echo. Fix the echo. Hold on.
I thought the echo was just on my end, but I was wrong about that.
All right, how's that? Let us know if you still hear echo, and let me know if you can hear me. All right, how's that?
So I unmuted the actual video, and that sounds like it's good. So I think we're good now.
Let us know if you still
There's a delay now that it's creating, but I think we're good.
Let me know if you can hear me. Okay, all right. So Hard Times 57. Sorry about the terrible audio. We're good to go now.
If it makes sorry guys, the audio is only on your end. It's not on our end for that. So we didn't really know that was happening until it did.
All right, I think everybody in the comments saying we're pretty good. So, okay, so that was we were echoing on our kind of spiel about college football nerds, but just to short and sweet, we are now collegefootballnerds.com, and obviously the SEC fans branding is kind of going to go away, but yeah, check it out if you want to. If you want to dig up our stats or kind of follow us from there, if you don't have the notifications, which you should have the notifications. But all right, so let's get into talking some college football. First off, I think there is a valid and worthy discussion about the Heisman that needs to be had. Josh, for me, a lot of Alabama fans are frustrated that Kyler Murray won the Heisman. And before we get into if Tua should have won the Heisman, I think it's fair to discuss Dwayne Haskins. I made a point on Twitter earlier this week that if Tua suffered from recency bias, which is pretty clear he did, because against Auburn, he is 324 yards and 6 touchdowns. Everybody completely forgot that as soon as the SEC championship game happened. If he suffered from recency bias, why didn't Dwayne Haskins benefit from recency bias? Because he ended the season in the last 2 or 3 games statistically better than either one of these two and had a monster season. I know he had a couple of games where he didn't have great yards per attempt, namely the Purdue game and the Michigan State game, but is it fair to say that he was kind of snubbed in that at least he wasn't given the same footing and same billing as the other two?
First, I'm going to note to you, Daniel, that we fixed the audio issue, and I don't think it's a huge deal, but there's a significant delay from our video to our audio as a side effect of whatever we did. But second, actually getting to the answer to your question, I think this year more than most any other, to a certain extent, what we really saw was people looking for an excuse to knock somebody off the list. So people were kind of waiting for one of the quarterbacks to, slip up this year. And when they slipped up, they were off. Everybody sort of tuned out Haskins.
The same footing
and that's why he fell off so much. I agree with you. When you look at what Haskins did at the end of the year, you, Daniel, that he came on pretty strong. Ohio State as a whole offensively was a different team at the end of the season than they were
same billing
early on in the season. I mean, they played at a different level. It was, we mentioned this talking about the Maryland game. That game, a lot of people view as a really bad game, but to slip up. What it showed me to a certain extent was that Ohio State's offense was at a level where they could actually try to keep up, keep pace, and be able to outscore somebody that was playing at a high level, playing in a tough game. Because when they were in the Purdue game and they lost 49-20, I think something that everybody misses is the 49 was bad, but Purdue could score a lot of points, and Ohio State's defense wasn't great. That wasn't otherworldly shocking. What was shocking is that the Purdue defense that is not very good held Ohio State to 20 points. So I think, I think to a certain degree, Ohio State in general played at a different level. So you're talking about recency bias and all. Recency bias should have come into play. And I'm looking right here. So in the month of November, in terms of pure quarterback rating, Kyler Murray had actually, this is really interesting. I didn't realize this. In November, oh gosh, apparently the echo is back, Daniel. So they're hearing everything I'm saying twice over myself. I don't know. We'll get it sorted. I'm just going to keep speaking and we'll deal with it. Kyler Murray in the month of November had a 176.1 QB rating. Should have come into play. Tua Tagovailoa in his November, where he, quote, struggled against some really good teams. And by struggled, it means he, only won by 24, 29 points. He averaged a 178.3 QB rating. So Tagovailoa had a higher QB rating than Murray, 178 to 176 in the month of November. Dwayne Haskins was just behind them, though, at 166.5. And, I don't know. The last thing I'll leave off with, and I know I'm kind of stalling here because we're dealing with other stuff, but Murray and Tua, at the end of the day, I don't think any of this is unfounded. I can have this discussion about recency bias, but Murray had a 205.7 QB rating. Tua had a 202.3 QB rating. Those are set to be the two. If they maintain it, those are the two highest quarterback ratings ever in college football history. So even though Haskins did very well, and at the end of the season he was close to the other two, his year-long metric at 175 is fourth this year, but it's a very distant fourth, and it's not a historical mark. Likewise, Murray currently is first all-time in yards per attempt at 11.7. Tua is third all-time in yards per attempt at 11.4. And Mayfield, by the way, is actually second. He's the guy in between the two. Haskins isn't even in the top 100 nationally. So I do think it's pretty justified. What Murray and Tagovailoa did, ignoring total yards in and of itself, everything else, what they did was completely historic. And Haskins, most years, would have been a very viable candidate for the Heisman. He just happens to go against what is statistically the two best quarterbacking seasons in college football history.
And I guess, like, I don't necessarily think that Haskins should have won it, but my issue was more that I felt like, okay.
So I'm going to start scrolling back and look at some comments. I think I lost Daniel for a moment. At least I can't hear him.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I was just kind of letting that breathe a little bit. But what I was saying, really, I see why Haskins didn't win it. I get that. But if Tua didn't win it, it's pretty clear he didn't win it because of the Georgia game. I don't know how. I mean, he was everybody's favorite coming into the Georgia game. He played on fire against Auburn, like absolutely on fire against Auburn. 52 points against the number 16 defense. So it looks like they were highly influenced by the end of the season, in the very end of the season. Well, Dwayne Haskins balled out. I mean, the last couple of games was just out of his mind, and it seems like that wasn't enough recency, but to influence recency bias to at least have him be more in the discussion. That was my frustration. But yeah, I don't have a huge problem with Kyler Murray winning this award. I think both, if not all three, deserve the award. I do think it's funny, though, because I hear a lot of chatter from Alabama fans that want to talk about how bad the defenses he faced were. But it's kind of like or I guess I should ask you, is it kind of like we said with Clemson all year, where Kyler Murray can be facing trash defenses and still be an elite plus quarterback, just like we saw Tua versus a Louisville was still making elite plays?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you have to be a little careful in that when you're trying to compare guys or talk about them in a negative fashion. The fact that somebody doesn't play an elite team does not necessarily make them bad in and of itself. What it does is makes them unproven, which means it's a question mark. I go back to this example a lot. 2014 Ohio State was a very unproven team. They played an extremely weak schedule outside their early loss to Virginia Tech. The second half of the season, they dominated that schedule to a hilarious degree. And a lot of people in the SEC completely discounted everything they did because their schedule was really weak that year. But I think everybody figured out in the playoffs that didn't mean they were a bad team. And to your point, I don't really know is the issue exactly how Kyler Murray is going to do playing Alabama. If you look at any sort of advanced stats, so, while I'm talking here, I can pretty quickly pull up the statistical profiles. Oklahoma has not faced anything that I would call an upper level defense or a good defense by any measure. And everybody sort of knows that, but I think it's important to understand just how far away really they are. So looking at S&P ratings for defense, I want to say the best team is Iowa State. I think they're around, where are they? 31st. And then if you go down from Iowa State, I want to say Texas is the only other one. That's what my memory serves. Texas is 55th. So you've got two teams outside the top 30. No team that they played inside the top 30 in S&P Plus defense. Now, when they played teams, including Texas, they could lit them up. The question is, Alabama sitting at 8th, may not necessarily. I mean, they have some issues that give up explosive plays, but you're dealing with, in terms of standard downs, the top defense in the country. It's going to be a significant change. And it's not just that they're better than anybody's Oklahoma's played. It's, if you want to talk in I often describe things in terms of, say, standard deviation. So in statistical terms, if you want to think of it like tiers, everybody that Oklahoma's played is average or worse defensively. And then above that, you can have, and let's say Iowa State and Texas. We'll call them good. We'll call them good defenses. Above them, you'd have defenses that are very good. A very good defense would be Auburn. It would be Florida. And then above them are the elite defenses. And the problem is the elite defenses is everybody else in the playoff. It's Clemson, Notre Dame, and Alabama are all in the top 8. Those teams are not just better than anyone they've played. they're 2 levels better. They could have played an Auburn who would have been or an LSU who would have been a different level than anyone they played. And these 3 teams they're going to play in the playoffs are an even different level than that. So it's incredibly difficult to sort of project how good Murray and the Oklahoma offense is going to be.
So Space Jesus asked, what do we think about players sitting out of bowl games? This is a huge pet peeve of mine. I tweeted about it earlier. I've been tweeting a lot this week, so you're going to hear a lot of my thoughts that I've already tweeted. I think it's kind of a slap in the face to the teammates who built you up to get you in a draftable position. Let's talk Will Grier for a minute. That guy means everything to that offense, to the point that I've argued that if we're going to say Kyler Murray deserves the Heisman because without Kyler Murray, Oklahoma loses a bunch of games, then Will Grier absolutely under those guidelines should win the Heisman because he meant more to his team than anybody else. What about the guys, let's say wide receivers? What if, and there's one, I think, is it Sills that's going to go regardless, but what if there's a couple of other borderline wide receivers, offensive linemen, running backs on that team that need their quarterback there for one more showcase where more eyeballs than normal are watching them to kind of put them in over the top? Maybe they're borderline drafty, maybe they're borderline combine invite, and they need their brother there with them to put them over the top. Instead, you get this love letter on Twitter about how it's, taught me the meaning of team and family. P.S. guys, you're on your own. I'm out. I'm going to go get mine. And I hate that so much. It is absolutely their right to do it, and I understand that. But the odds of you getting hurt, I know there are some instances. I think it was Jake Butt that got a bad knee injury in the bowl game. But it's pretty rare that you're going to get hurt. Really, it's just I want this last month or whatever to work out and get ready or whatever. And I think more than anything, to the fans that got you where you are and the players around you that got you where you are, it's kind of a middle finger.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I mean, at some level, and I understand what people are saying, that they've got other situations going on. Greedy Williams at LSU, he's talked a lot about the fact that he came from a really bad part of town. He's got a lot of family issues. He's got a kid. It's a tough position to be in. I think the problem is, if that's the concern, why did you play against A&M? Why did you play the last 3 games of the season? Why don't you just give up the moment you're not playing for a conference title or a national title? Where does that stop? I think if you're playing in a given year, you should be committed to playing the year out. And that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point, and that's where we're headed. Because all of the pundits that support this are the same people who don't give a fair, honest look at how much benefit players get from going to play at a college in terms of room and board and food and training and education. These are the same people that are all about these guys getting theirs. They don't think about the big picture. But you're right. When you're no longer in playoff contention, or Nick Bosa's case you are, when you're no longer in playoff contention, why not just quit mid-season? If you really want to focus on your chance to be in the NFL, have a few games early where you ball out, put up a good number or two, and then, hey, I've got to look out for my livelihood. I've got to look out for my future, and just stop playing in week 4.
I'd agree with that. Interesting points when he made Vincent Collette that Giles has been a huge disappointment at LSU. I'm not trying to be negative in saying this, but if you watched our preseason content or first game content, which people likely didn't, a lot of people hadn't tuned in yet, we actually had a long spiel on why, after watching film, I didn't think he was going to be quite the guy that a lot of people expected him to be. I think he got underutilized or misutilized a lot this year at LSU, but the problem with him is he doesn't have prototypical size, and he's not really a true number 1 receiver, and they're in a very pro-style offense. And he's the kind of guy that is a good slot receiver in a spread, and he was never going to be the guy, in my opinion, that was going to be super successful in the style of offense that LSU was trying to run. So that really wasn't a huge surprise to either of us, I don't think.
There's some questions about Alabama's defense this year. Clemson man said, is Alabama's defense better than Georgia's 2017 defense? because Oklahoma's offense is definitely better. I would argue Oklahoma's offense is not better.
It's different.
It's different. Rodney Anderson was a huge part of that offense last year. I understand Baker Mayfield was awesome, had a great year. But it is different with Kyler Murray, and there is a little more mobile quarterback aspect to it. I would say that Alabama's defense is more equipped to handle Oklahoma's offense. But look, Alabama is going to give up points in this game. If they give up 30, 35, I'm not surprised at all. We need to remember last year, Georgia gave up 45 points to Oklahoma. One of those was a pick six. So they gave up 38 points in regulation, but they only gave up 7 points in the second half. Seeing this offense for the first time is hard. Like, a lot is coming at you that you cannot prepare for, and that's what happened with Georgia last year. But man, they adjusted quick, and 7 points in the second half. So I don't know if Alabama's defense is more equipped, but I will say this: where Georgia had a good offensive game and scored 45 offensively, Alabama, with a healthy Tua, I'm not saying this to be disrespectful, could score 70 points. They scored 62 in 3/4 against Ole Miss, and Ole Miss statistically and on the field, especially if you compare them to the Texas Tech game, Alabama scored 62 in that game. Ole Miss has a better defense.
Yeah. I mean, I have to agree with that assessment. I mean, the reality of it is you can't really downplay it. Oklahoma's defense is really bad. And I think last year, you got to be a little careful too, talking about what Oklahoma was last year versus this year. The thing that killed Georgia is the same thing that killed Ohio State last year facing Oklahoma. And that was Baker Mayfield and his ability to create and make reads and keep the offense running when little else was working. He was a magician at moving the sticks. Kyler Murray in this offense has been utterly explosive at Oklahoma. Again, we have the serious issue that we don't even know in a wide range what Oklahoma looks like against an elite team. I don't know that Murray is the kind of guy that's going to make a read and make a quick throw in pressure to get you a 3rd and 9 conversion or a 3rd and 5 conversion with the kind of consistency that Mayfield was. I think he's a very different sort of player. And they have a lot going for him, especially the offensive line. I think it's just terrifically underrated. But the thing, and we'll talk about this more in a preview video, Oklahoma in that style of offense that is very spread often doesn't scale at a high level. It reminds me a lot of Alabama's 2014 offense with Lane Kiffin that set most of Alabama's single season records for offense. And when they played elite level defenses, just utterly stalled. It looks a lot like a Lane Kiffin offense to me. I'm not saying it will stall. I'm really not saying that. What I'm basically saying is there are things about it that tell me that it will be affected by a significant margin against a better defense. But I don't think we're going to know how that turns out until they play it. Whereas with Baker Mayfield, it really seemed like you couldn't slow down that Oklahoma team last year.
So Shane Bentley with the super chat. Thank you very much. Let's talk about Shane's dogs. I do think this game is super interesting. I don't love second and third order transitive property stuff, but there is an opportunity for the SEC or teams playing SEC teams and the ACC to be the games leading up to the playoff to potentially be canaries in the coal mine. I think Georgia will come into this game motivated. And I don't think that, I mean, it's the Sugar Bowl. It's still a big deal. I know that game that lost Alabama sucks, but unlike last year where it was the last play of the game and there's nothing else to play for and you got to have it sit with you the whole year, they lost a heartbreaker to Alabama, and now they get to go out and take it out on somebody. It'll be interesting to see how Georgia does versus Texas, how West Virginia does versus Syracuse, how some of these teams that playoff teams played and struggled with, or didn't struggle with, if it sort of is a leading indicator to how the playoff's going to go. And I honestly think Georgia. So I pegged one of the mismatches to me was Texas A&M and who are they playing? UVA or they're playing NC State. I think that's a huge mismatch, and I think Georgia might just go ham in New Orleans. What do you think?
I definitely think it's a very serious possibility. Again, I think something that's telling about that Oklahoma-Texas game is that Oklahoma did have some issues offensively in both of those games. They were stalled at times. And it's easy to overlook that Texas, as a, quote, good defense, in S&P, they're still 55th nationally. I mean, they're actually a bottom-level Power 5 defense. It's just, whether you want to say it's created by the conference or not, we can't really answer that question yet. Texas was a low-level defense. So there are a lot of signs that Georgia is going to come in and be able to have a tremendous amount of success against Texas themselves. And I think defensively, I don't really see Texas being able to hardly score at all. So I think that game could get out of hand pretty quickly. Here's an interesting question. Matt Canada better than Lane Kiffin as an offensive coordinator?
I already answered this in the text, so I'll let you answer it because, yes, I think Matt Canada in certain scenarios I think he can do more with less than Lane Kiffin.
Yeah, I agree. I think Lane Kiffin's offense, it's a complaint I was making, not complaint, but the observation really I was trying to make about how Oklahoma's offense may or may not fare in the playoffs. Lane Kiffin's offense is terrific when he can out-athlete you. When he's got faster guys than you have, he'll put up 45 points in a game. And when they've played teams that had superior talent or teams that just and even in Alabama, they may not have had superior talent, but when he played really good defenses where he loves receiver screens, he loves trying to hit play action bombs. If teams can play you straight up and you have to create things schematically rather than just taking the easy play, it just shuts down. Whereas Matt Canada, I kind of saw the opposite. Canada's offense didn't scale to the same level that Kiffin's does. It doesn't blow out bad teams. But Canada found ways to score points. He did it at Maryland. He did it at LSU, where nothing really worked offensively, and they were clearly outmatched, and he would still find a way to put 20 points up in a game. There's no way LSU beats Auburn in 2017. No way they beat Auburn with Matt Canada, and I don't think Lane Kiffin could have done it with that roster.
There was a comment about Jay Sternberger getting screwed over on the John Mackey Award. At first blush, I didn't think so because TJ Hawkinson is really good and he stepped up really big in important games. And I said after week 1, maybe coming into the season, I don't remember, that Jay Sternberger was my surprise guy in the SEC this year. He won I think he was first team All SEC over Irv Smith, and I thought that was fair. Even though Irv Smith had a great year for Alabama, I thought he was first team All SEC, all that. He had almost 100 more yards and another touchdown with the same amount of catches as TJ Hawkinson. So I tend to agree. Let's see. What's
maybe I'm crazy.
Question?
I think he actually got named first team AP All-American too. So.
He did, and he should have won.
Yeah, or at least been a finalist. That's the crazy thing.
NC State can cause some problems for A&M passing the ball. I think they can, but Josh, do you have the stat I gave you earlier today about NC State?
I had it pulled up. Let me see if I scroll down, but I'll get it very quickly if you want to keep talking. Here we go. I got it.
Yeah.
So NC State's wins this year were against James Madison, Marshall, Virginia, Boston College, Florida State, Louisville, North Carolina, and ECU.
Yeah, the stat was 5 of 9 wins were against teams who had at least 9 losses or were FCS. The other 3 were Florida State, BC, UVA, and then they beat Marshall. Yes. That's another one where we don't know. They might be better than we think they are. They lost they gave up 40 points per game in their 3 losses. 46 points per game against ranked teams. They gave up 51 to Syracuse, but they did score 41 in that game. And Syracuse has a pretty decent defense, so I agree they might be able to throw the ball, especially against an A&M secondary that's not good. It's objectively not good, but I don't think I think physically they're going to have a hard time matching Texas A&M.
And I'm looking at I feel like these statistical profiles may have a slight issue with them. This is the official stuff from S&P and Football Outsiders. But NC State only played one top 40 team all year, and that was Clemson. They lost. Otherwise, against teams in the top 70, they were 2-2. They lost to 43rd Syracuse. They beat 42nd Virginia and 49th Marshall. And they lost to 77th Wake Forest. So, and this is kind of our problem all year with the ACC, and we really are genuinely not trying to bash the ACC. Let me be really clear to Clemson, man. Clemson ran roughshod through the ACC, so that's why I keep making those Ohio State 2014 comparisons. The rest of the ACC, though, statistically is terrible. And we've made the point several times, they're much closer to the AAC than they are the SEC. They're almost a group of 5 conference. And if you took Clemson out, they would be about a group of 5 level. It makes it incredibly difficult to judge how good a team like NC State is, because week in and week out, the teams they played were so weak. I do think NC State's passing game with Finley can be really good. Finley struggles tremendously when pressured in that offense, and his receivers, like in the Clemson game, were bizarrely ineffective. But on the flip side, NC State's pass defense is horrid. Truly, truly terrible. And in as much as A&M is really disjointed, I could see A&M, when they play teams that are really bad defensively, they may put up enough points that none of the rest of this really matters.
So there's a question about the Big Ten Conference missing the playoffs the last 3 years. The Big Ten West being one of the reasons why. So here's the thing. I saw the whole, and this is probably a good segue into that. And Clemson, man, yes, 2016 ACC was really good. They're the best conference in the country, no question. And that's why when we're down on a conference, that doesn't necessarily mean we're down on that conference like haters. It just means that year they're not that good. This is a segue into this eight playoff team thing. I saw the Big Ten commissioner and Big 12 commissioner complaining about being left out and basically saying it's an injustice because their conference got left out. It's not an injustice. What would be an injustice is if you get to roll out of bed, lose by 31 to Iowa or 29 to a team that couldn't beat Missouri, and be on equal footing with an Alabama who had to go undefeated. And oh, by the way, you were saying, Big Ten fans were saying, that Alabama, having a tougher schedule going into the conference championship week than Ohio State, should be out if they lost to Georgia and Ohio State beat Northwestern. So if Alabama loses a close game to number 4, they're out, but you get to lose by 29 to Purdue, and that's not an elimination for you. It's frustrating to me when the narrative is there's some sort of bias, there's some sort of this and that, and they don't evaluate and give a fair shake to the actual resumes and what happened. You didn't get left out because of bias. You get left out because you couldn't beat Purdue, and you lost by 30 points, and you need to be punished for that. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think it's self-evident. The reality of college football, every year, conferences are isolated. We never really completely know where conferences are at. But it's definitely true this year that I think I've heard this described a lot this year, that this year had more chalk than any other year. Chalk, if you're unfamiliar with the term, meaning that the favorite wins. Higher the teams at the very top. Let's say the top 8 to 12 teams were heavy favorites in most all their games, and they almost always won. And it was the big name teams. If you think about who would you name as football? Florida, Texas, Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma. Everybody that's a big named college football team pretty much dominated the top of the sport. And the flip side to that, though, is that some of the conferences like the Big Ten, it created a low margin of error. And we talked about this back and forth, so we're not going to beat a dead horse with it. But there's a big part of the argument with Ohio State was how much of it are you putting in the best 4 teams because you say these are the four teams that are most likely to win on a neutral field today, and how much of it are you waiting the entire season? Because at some level, in my view, you do have to punish someone for a 30-point loss to an unranked team. And that's why I think they made the right decision to put Oklahoma in. I don't necessarily believe Oklahoma is better than Ohio State, and I'm not entirely sure I do think that, but I do think you just have to punish Ohio State. Is I don't think it's unfair to say that. I almost say as unfair as that is. It's just kind of the way the world is with 4 teams. And the next point is, does that mean we need to go to 8? And I already see people are starting to bring that point up in the comments.
Yeah, and somebody said Big Ten got left out because Michigan choked and gave up 60 to Ohio State, and that's true. Big Ten doesn't get left out this year. They were actually ahead of Oklahoma with a loss, so it's not bias. It's just you didn't perform on the field. You can't give up 60 points and be in the show, and you can't just show up in the last game of the year and then beat Northwestern and be in the show. You can, but maybe you need to remove any doubt. Anyway, I said earlier today, Josh, tell me what you think. If they were going to expand at all, I hate the idea of 8. I hate the idea of auto bids for conference winners. And this is kind of the same thing I just said. It's not fair. Washington lost to Auburn, a team that Alabama beat 52-21. They also lost to Cal and Oregon. That should not they should not be on equal footing in the playoffs against an Alabama who went 13-0. They just shouldn't. It's not fair. It's not fair that an Alabama or a Notre Dame or somebody else might injure their quarterback and then not have them for the rest of the way and lose the playoffs because someone who lost 3 games, and not good games, won their conference and got in. But okay, aside from that, I said if they expanded at all, 6 teams, top 2 get a bye. All but the final round are on college campuses to the higher seed stadium. What do you think?
I can get behind that. I think both of us are really on the same page. There's a fine line when you get beyond giving everybody a shot and you start getting into giving people a shot that have already kind of, blown their opportunity, so to speak. And this year, the auto berth thing, I just don't agree with. There have been way too many examples when a team did not need to be in the playoff because they clearly weren't capable. Wasn't there a year, I think it was UConn, right? Didn't they play like Florida State one year because they won the Big East?
Yeah.
And they were not a good team. It was just a crap show in the Big East.
And they sent like 8,000 fans to the BCS
right,
Bowl.
And that's why the auto berth thing I think just doesn't work. I mean, it's easy to say. It's really easy to say in retrospect if you're an Ohio State fan. Oh, you need to have auto berths. It's great and wonderful, but Ohio State is in anyway. If you take the top 6 today, it's just right now you'd be taking Georgia and Ohio State. I can get behind 6. I agree with you. I think logistically the home stadium versus bowl thing, there's a lot of complications there into bowl tie-ins and the politics of it. Honestly, there's a lot of self-servingness there with the NCAA ties to bowls and the bowls trying to maintain their own stature. We could talk about that for a long time, but something I will say to sort of frame that whole discussion, always remember the NCAA is dominated by the smaller schools. The big name schools have no more votes than anyone else. It's a vote-based, member-driven institution. Most of the rules are set in place to keep the group of 5 teams, honestly, competitive.
It's the Senate, right, not the House.
It is the Senate, not the House. And it would favor the top teams to maybe expand things and do things differently. But the biggest thing was it would really favor the top teams to move stuff to their home stadiums. They would freaking love that. It would make them a ton of money. But when it moves it to their stadium, they get the money and the NCAA and their partners do not. So they're not going to change that. I think it's the unfortunate reality. But I do think, like last year, UCF, I get the argument that a group of 5 team in the top 4 format may not ever be able to get in. It be exceptionally difficult to the point of impossible. There's a time when Boise State, I think, would have gotten in, but the run it took to get there was just insane. However, when you start expanding it to 8, it's hard for me to give you a year when I'm looking back. So it pretty much, I can never give you an example where somebody who's the 8th ranked team probably shouldn't have been in the playoff. A 2-loss Penn State last year. This year you end up with Michigan, who's another 2-loss team, didn't win their conference. You go back to 2016, 3-loss Florida State in 2016, 3-loss Penn State in 2016, 2-loss Ohio State. That 8th team almost always, those are final rankings, so I guess that isn't actually completely true. So let me look at 2016. All right, Wisconsin. It would have been a 3-loss Wisconsin team getting in 2016. You don't want 3-loss teams in the playoff. If you've lost 3 games, and I don't even really care what your schedule is, if you've lost 3 games, you should be out. You've lost your opportunity, in my view.
Yeah, I think the auto bid thing comes from a mentality of NFL fans where there is pretty good parity, and a 10-6 team is still equipped to win a championship. We don't have that. There has never been a year in college football where all 5 conferences were equally good. There's just too many teams and too much quality spread around. Yes, we have some concentration at the top in 1 or 2 teams, but never is a conference schedule. Like Washington this year with 3 losses, again, is my point. And I like Washington. I've been high on that program for a while. You don't get to lose to Cal. You don't get to lose to Oregon and lose to a team that Alabama beat 52-21 and still say, well, they won their conference. Well, how many teams in the SEC could have won the Pac-12 this year? Auburn's got a reasonable argument that they could have won the Pac-12 this year because they could have won the Pac-12 because they still could have lost 2 games. Washington lost 2 conference games and still won the Pac-12. So there's a lot of talk right now in the comments about UCF and LSU. I want to touch on that. LSU fans don't get too confident in this game. I will say not having McKenzie Milton there is a big deal for UCF, but they did beat Memphis pretty bad with their backup quarterback. And per our previous discussion, Greedy Williams, I don't think is playing in this game. So LSU's still good secondary, but that's a big hit.
Yeah. To your point earlier, I'll touch on again. Auburn beat Washington. You can't forget it, but it wasn't. Watching that game was not a fluke, and it has to be said. Auburn finished 10th in the SEC. They weren't even a top half team. But yeah, LSU, UCF. UCF's a team that can put up points. I think if McKenzie Milton was there, I'd be pretty concerned about LSU, honestly, without Greedy Williams, because the fall off at corner behind Fulton and Williams is pretty significant. But I don't know how they weren't overly effective passing the ball without Milton. The backup quarterback, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now, but they won that Memphis game by running it down their throats. It's maybe a little bit of a concern because LSU's run defense isn't elite, but LSU's run defense is still much better than anything UCF's faced. I think at least to the degree that UCF isn't going to be able to score 1,000 points by running it. But the flip side of that, UCF's defense isn't great, fantastic. LSU's offense is so inefficient that it almost doesn't matter how bad you are. LSU, even when it's easy to forget early in the year, right, when they were playing their kind of cupcake schedule against like Louisiana Tech, they put up 38 on La Tech, and they did it late. They put up 31 on Southeast Louisiana. They really couldn't hardly blow out anyone all year. Even Rice is one of the worst teams in college football this year. One of the very worst teams. They managed 42. So it's hard for me to think that even if UCF's defense isn't fantastic, LSU's probably going to struggle to hit 40. That seems to be where their offense is at. And, 40 is a high number, but if they don't have Greedy Williams and as good as UCF's offense is, that does give UCF a chance to win something like a 31-30 kind of game.
But look, and somebody said, what's the SEC going to say if UCF wins? UCF's ranked ahead of LSU right now currently. What's the rest of the country going to say if LSU wins? Because all we heard all year was LSU's overrated, LSU sucks, LSU shouldn't be in the top 10. But, look, UCF, and there is a joke that I made that they'll probably claim another national championship if they beat LSU. But Alabama beat LSU by 30, and they shut it down in the third quarter. I don't know that the number one Group of 5 team in the country who's undefeated shouldn't give LSU.
LSU's a 3-loss team. They lost 3 teams in conference play this year. Looking at, I mean, they're, depending on how you want to define it, so 1, 2, 3, they're at best 4th in the SEC. Behind A&M, they have a tiebreaker, Alabama and Georgia. So UCF wants to claim a national title. If you want to say you're a national title caliber team and really make that argument emphatically, you're going to need to do more than beat LSU close when LSU, wasn't even really that close to contention for the SEC. When you consider the A&M loss, wasn't really at the end of the season even really in contention to get to the SEC championship game. I mean, UCF should give them a very good game. The really all UCF can really do here, in my view, is lose, because if they beat LSU, it's going to be easy to say at that point, you beat a 4-loss team. And if LSU beats them, and especially if they win convincingly, everybody's going to look back on it and go, okay, an LSU team that lost 3 games that got blanked by Alabama in kind of embarrassing fashion at home, and you can't run with them, and you were trying to claim that you needed to be in the playoff, it's a no-win situation for UCF.
It's not entirely fair with Mackenzie Milton being out. I get that, but let's just take the UCF offense off the table. If LSU comes up and puts a 40 burger on them, I think that there is enough to show that, hey, you probably didn't belong this year. But I like UCF. I like that program. I think that I think that they just need to. Here's the thing. They were complaining about the teams in the SEC and other teams not wanting to play them. They demanded a 1-for-1 home and home with Florida. Florida offered them a 2-for-1 and they didn't take it. And that flew all over me, because I don't know if you remember, Josh, you're younger than me, but back in the 90s, Southern Miss had this motto, because they were trying to get their program back, to national visibility. They had their motto, and they wrote it on the field. They would play anybody, anywhere, anytime. And they played a ton of Florida States and Alabamas all on the road. They were all paycheck games, but they also beat a lot of those teams and put their name back on the map. UCF, if you're saying that you need to play big-time teams to prove who you are, you shouldn't care about home and home in your 40,000-seat stadium. You should care more about the visibility and the optics of being able to play one of those big-time teams. When you're the undercard that honestly these teams don't benefit at all for playing you, you don't get to dictate terms. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with it. And I know something's been made of the fact that UCF has trouble scheduling teams. That's a complicated fact, because I've been privy to some other discussions. I do remember Southern Miss's schedule, and when they were playing teams in the regular, they played Alabama all through the 90s. They beat them in 2000, I think. And then obviously there was this, so did everybody else that year, I guess. But there were also the early years, early 2000s, right? Brett Favre, it's just a little bit before my time. But yeah, you got to go the Boise route. You got to schedule teams, make a point to schedule them in their home stadium, which teams are often not willing to do. I heard one tidbit that's always hauled out to me. We talk about Alabama a lot just because they're kind of the banner for the SEC, that we're talking about Georgia more now. But Boise State was trying to schedule with Alabama, and Alabama was willing to play Boise at Tuscaloosa. They were willing to do it. And Boise's response was, no, we'll play you if you'll do a home and home. And Alabama was just like, no, we're not going to Boise, Idaho to play a game where none of our fans will be able to travel in a very hostile, isolated stadium on a weird field turf. We're not doing it. We're willing to play you. If you want to prove yourself and come here and try to beat us, so be it. But we're not going to go to Boise. And so a lot of those discussions about teams and scheduling, and it's a big reason why, by the way, everybody complains about the lack of home and homes for the SEC. That's part of the complications to that. It's a lot easier to schedule a one-off at a neutral site because both teams get money, and it's a lot easier to sort of get around that contractually. If you're UCF and you want to really prove yourself, get slotted in that slot instead of a Fresno State at their stadium, because that's what you're going to have to do to earn people's respect.
And if you think you belong in the show, you might have to do a little more than everybody else, because when you're playing SMU and La Tech, other teams, there's a joke there about SEC teams out of conference scheduling, but other teams are playing Power 5 conferences. Last year, UCF had the 103rd best strength of schedule. They had 2 close games, one against SMU and one against Memphis, that they had to come from behind and win. SMU lost to La Tech in their bowl game 51-14. They claim that they beat the team that beat the team in Auburn, but Alabama lost to Auburn on the road when they were healthy. Georgia played Auburn in that same building and beat them by 3 touchdowns 3 weeks before UCF beat them. So I think random account thing, home and home, means that the teams agree to play 1 year in the one team stadium and another year in the next team stadium. So they're usually scheduled well in advance, and they schedule 2 at a time. So I think Georgia next year gets the return.
Yeah, and then Alabama is scheduled to do home and home with Notre Dame. But to your point, it's in 8 years. They have to be scheduled way in advance.
They have a Texas home and home ahead of that, before that, and then the USC game in 2 years, I think, is at a neutral site. We're talking about Kyler Murray and Tua and the Heisman, and will it be settled on the field versus Oklahoma? I don't know that it will. Because part of this, Josh, and tell me what you think. Part of this, I think, is the Lincoln Riley system. I want to challenge you, Alabama fans, to go and just watch some of these games. There's full games on YouTube. Go back and watch the West Virginia game. I know West Virginia doesn't play good defense, but Lincoln Riley's offense, not just Kyler Murray, that offense is a work of art. And I think Alabama can give up 35 and still win by 3 touchdowns. But I don't know that they're going to be able to anybody's going to be able to shut this offense down enough to where you can say, look, Kyler Murray didn't deserve it and Tua did. What do you think?
I agree with that. And this goes back to our earlier statement when we were discussing this at the beginning of the show, and I know a lot of people hadn't tuned in yet. There's a major issue where the defenses Oklahoma's faced, it's not just that they're not as good as Alabama, they're 2 or 3 tiers below. Every single one. I cannot give you a single good example. Even the Iowa State and Texas games, when they're in Army, when those are your best examples and they're not very good, it says a lot. But to your point, I think I just, from what I've seen, I don't think you can completely stop Oklahoma. They remind me, and we're not trying to turn this into an Oklahoma-Alabama preview, which is why I've avoided talking about the matchups too much. But they remind me a lot of that 2012 Texas A&M team. I mean, they've got a mobile quarterback with a live arm. They've got really good receivers, and they have a phenomenal offensive line that gets a lot of accolades, but I still think they're badly underrated because not enough people realize how good they are. And you've heard me say this a million times. In my opinion, 2012 Texas A&M with Johnny Manziel, that team was more about the offensive line than it was Manziel. When A&M played Oklahoma in a bowl game, and I can't remember if that was 2012 or 13, not that it really matters. I remember at one point I counted 8 seconds before Manziel had to leave the pocket. And at times, Oklahoma has been just that dominant. So people talk about Murray, but it's a whole dang offense, and nobody can get any pressure because the offensive line's so good. That A&M team, it's one thing to say they had 3, multiple first-round picks. They had both offensive tackles went number 1 in the draft. And then a third guy went as a first-round draft pick tackle that couldn't play tackle because you already had 2 others. So, Oklahoma is that kind of talented. I do think, so I agree with you. And, Alabama's had a lot of issues with confusion in the back 7, and that's all going to come into play. I do think, though, I don't know. I do think losing Hollywood Brown could be a pretty big, really big blow to Oklahoma.
Yeah, Kyler Murray said he'd play, but when you have a wide receiver with a foot injury who is in tears on the sideline on his last game of the season, I don't think that gets better in a month to where you're back to 4.3, 4.35 kind of speed with your cuts and stuff. I would be surprised, but they've got plenty of talent.
Yeah, he's one of the most explosive he is one of the most explosive athletes in the country, bar none. So anything that affects his speed is going to be a massive blow.
So let's talk maybe some other bowl games. We're going to do bowl previews, y'all. Josh doesn't know this. I haven't told him this, but I want to do bowl previews for all the SEC teams, and then maybe a couple others that don't involve SEC teams, especially Clemson and Notre Dame.
That's good to know. I'm committed
Let's talk a little bit about. Let's talk a little bit about maybe Florida, Michigan. This is weird for me because everybody's like, ugh, they're playing again. But this is another game that might be the storyline and might be decided more by who's not playing than who is. Rashawn Gary's out. Harbaugh said that there's more to come. Florida's already had a couple of announcements to say that they're not playing. So on paper, I think Florida's at kind of a mismatch here. But again, we don't know how good that Michigan defense truly is. So this could be like a 13-17 turd fest. So let's talk about it.
Well, so Daniel really knows how to sell things in his intros. I think one thing to talk about maybe leading into it that's appropriate for this forum is how the bowl slots are going to affect the SEC. Because, and I talked about this a lot, I thought the SEC this year was probably, in terms of national perception, underrated. Everybody knows they're really good. I don't think people quite understand how much the depth comes into play. And I know I know there's some Clemson fans in the chat, and I think hopefully they can appreciate this. People went nuts because we said that South Carolina was going to be, one of the best teams that Clemson had played all year. And that was based off the fact that in terms of advanced stats, South Carolina, who's 12th in the SEC in advanced stats, was better than the second place team in the ACC, or second place, in Miami. The difference is pretty insane relative to other conferences. But that said, the SEC put 3 teams in New Year's Six bowls. So basically, everybody in the SEC is playing several slots up in terms of overall matchup. So Florida it's a little screwy because of the fact that you have a multi-way tie, but roughly 3rd or 4th in the SEC, probably about 4th in the SEC. And Michigan is the undisputed number 2. So the first thing to note there is it's kind of a shame for the SEC that every SEC team is going to be essentially playing 2 to 3 slots above their head in their opposing matchup.
Yeah, I think so. I think LSU is playing certainly a slot up. Look, Michigan was the clear number 2 in the Big Ten, but because the Big Ten didn't get a team in the playoffs, you've got Ohio State going to play a 3-loss team in the Rose Bowl, and then you have the number 2 team in the Big Ten playing a Florida team that got blown out by Missouri. So Michigan wins that game, and people are going to be like, ha, SEC sucks. But it's like, look, here's what I say about SEC teams when they lose out of conference. It's okay to crow if you beat an SEC team as bad as everybody else in the SEC beat them. So your point about LSU, it's okay to crow, haha, you belong at the top of the SEC, UCF. Your bar is Alabama beat them 29-0. So go crazy.
Yeah, I mean, Florida did not end the season well. Their secondary collapsed in that Georgia game. They had been suffering injuries all year. Both they and South Carolina, and halfway through the Georgia game, when I think 2 more secondary players went down, particularly when they lost another corner, and all of a sudden they've got a true freshman on the field. The second half of the Georgia game, Georgia just lit them up. And from that point on, they've given up at least 35 points every game. Or, excuse me, no, they gave up. That's not true. They gave up 10 to Idaho, but they gave up and 14 to Florida State. Sorry. But in SEC play, I guess, in SEC play, they gave up at least 30 points in every game. They could not stop Missouri. They could not stop South Carolina. They're going to be a little healthier in the bowl game, but it's still a good, not great team that lost 3 games in the SEC. They played LSU and played them close. And that was kind of their big win, where everybody in retrospect feels like Florida played over their heads to be able to beat LSU. We've already established that LSU may not necessarily be that great of a team. So you have them playing super clear cut number 2 in the Big Ten in Michigan. It's an ugly matchup.
All right, so let's talk about Notre Dame and Clemson for a minute. And Clemson, man, we are going to do a Notre Dame Clemson preview for sure. But I think it's fun to talk about. We've got, a couple of weeks to go before that game is really on the spotlight. So we have discussed all year about how Clemson can still be elite, and they ran roughshod over the ACC, and the ACC clearly sucks. It's not Clemson's fault. I didn't say they were trash. Josh gets onto me, y'all, because I say teams are trash. Like, I think it's fair to say that Arkansas was trash this year, but Josh gets onto me. So let's say the ACC
People get triggered, man.
Sucked.
This is a safe space.
We don't do a lot of transitive property, but we do some transitive property. Clemson beat Syracuse. Who did they beat 42-10? That was it Pitt. They beat the crap out of Pitt, right? And Notre Dame beat them 19-14. I don't think it's fair to look at the Syracuse game. We've talked about that, how for one, Notre Dame got Syracuse without their starting quarterback. He went down on like the second drive. Syracuse got Clemson when Trevor Lawrence got hurt in the first quarter. So I don't think those games are truly comparable. But if we're looking at that Pitt game, that really concerns me if I'm Notre Dame a lot. But I'll also say, I'm going to set this up for you because I want you to talk about both sides. Talk about the point disparity, and then talk about the fact that maybe Notre Dame is just the kind of team that, because they're well-rounded but not elite anywhere, they can be in a game with anybody, even if they can't blow somebody out.
So point disparity with what? I think I missed that point. Sorry.
They beat Pitt 19-14. Clemson beat 42.
Yeah, no, and it was early in the year, and so the first point with that is you kind of have to look at Pitt themselves, and a lot of our model's not perfect, y'all. We never claim it is. I never claim it is. There's some things it does well, some things it doesn't. We use the model so that when we analyze a team and we say X team is better than Y team, or this team is a lot closer to you than you think they are, that we have some sort of justification for it. Sometimes it's off the mark. Sometimes it's really good. The LSU Texas A&M game, we're going to have to quote that forever, that it had a tie to the thousandths of the decimal point, I think, which is kind of creepily accurate. But yeah, I mean, Pitt early in the season, they were not a very good team. Then mid-season, they weirdly beat Syracuse 44-37. They give Notre Dame a good game, lose 19-14. It's right after they got blown out by UCF. It's like they kind of flipped a switch after that. Beat Duke, who was a fairly good team, 54-45. Beat Virginia, who was a pretty good team, 23-13. Beat Virginia Tech, who really isn't a good team, but somehow still beat UVA. Haven't figured that one out yet. And then the end of the year, Miami, they lose badly 24-3, and then Clemson, they just can't even stay on the field. Pitt ebbed and flowed all year. And I think you have to be a little careful in drawing too much from them because that lost 51-6 to Penn State. So do you think Penn State's a better team than Clemson? Because Penn State beat them worse. Do you think Penn State's a better team than Notre Dame? Because I saw Penn State play Michigan, or I saw Penn State play Michigan. But, we saw Penn State in the Big Ten this year, and I don't.
Well, yeah, and you can't bring up that Michigan-Penn State game and what happened to our model. I'm still triggered about that. So
yeah. But the point there being, like, it doesn't really quite work because Notre Dame's better than Michigan. Michigan was a lot better than Penn State. Penn State destroyed Pitt worse than Clemson did, and Notre Dame barely beat them. So, go figure. There's a lot of complications to it. As to the matchup, without going into too much time, Notre Dame is very good offensively and defensively. And to our point earlier about, kind of how weak a lot of these conferences are, when you look at defensive strength, the ACC just wasn't good really in any way, shape, or form. And Clemson is the only top 25 defense in the ACC, and I'm still scrolling trying to find the first one. So it's Boston College. Boston College was 28th in S&P defense. If you follow college football enough, you know that there's a pretty big gap generally between, say, a top 10 unit and a top 25 unit. There's only, Power 5 conferences. I forget the exact numbers, floating around 65 Power 5 teams. So it's easy to say Boston College 28, that's solid. That's actually almost dead average for a Power 5 team. Notre Dame is 4th defensively. So I think people are sort of underestimating, too. Clemson struggled at times offensively with really good defenses. With teams like Texas A&M, that wasn't really a great defense by SEC standards and definitely was weak against the pass. But when teams could actually stop their run or at least somewhat hold it in check, they struggled. And I think Trevor Lawrence really did improve over the course of the year. I think they're a very good team now. But their run game, especially late in the season, was so ridiculously dominant with ETN that they could kind of do whatever the heck they wanted. And, even South Carolina, again, we talked about, I forget the number, but it was like 9 of 11 starters or something psychotic, the exact number of defensive starters that South Carolina was missing in that game. And in the 2 deep, it was something like 15 of 22 were missing. They had a true freshman, Horn, that was having a basically emergency start, and he didn't play in the game, so you had to find somebody else to replace him. Multiple transfer safeties didn't play in the game. I mean, it's just crazy. So point being that Clemson never really got challenged defensively. And the same issues we're talking about with Oklahoma earlier, I think you have to be careful that everything that says, oh, Alabama's going to come in and Oklahoma's going to be shell-shocked, Notre Dame could shell-shock Clemson. And I think it could be that Clemson shell-shocks Notre Dame because their offense is so much better than anything Notre Dame's faced. But to me, the Alabama-Oklahoma game, I expect a fairly high-scoring game that Alabama outpace Oklahoma, and I have a fair amount of confidence to it. Clemson-Notre Dame, I will say at the onset, at least right now, that's the game I have less confidence in picking. As much as everybody, I think, assumes Clemson's just going to blow out Notre Dame, and we've talked before that we don't really feel like they really should have deserved to be in the 4 slot. The problem is both those teams in the ACC, with as weak as their conference was offensively and defensively, we know so little about them that I wouldn't, personally, if you asked me to bet on the game, and there's no way in hell I ever would, I just don't really have much confidence in
it. Yeah, I don't either. Here's the thing. I think that Clemson can win this game. I hate to say this because we've said this about Clemson all year. Clemson can win this game and we still not know much about them. I am interested to see how Trevor Lawrence does against this defense. I wonder, though, Notre Dame struggles a little bit with really athletic and really explosive teams where they're not great. They're not like super athletic. They don't have a lot of elite talent at any position besides running back, in my opinion. Dexter Williams is a beast, by the way. So in aggregate, kind of a greater than the sum of their parts, defensively and offensively, they can grind you down and beat you. Where they struggle, like we saw even in 2012 Alabama, where they struggle is that explosive player kind of thing. And Clemson has that on every level except secondary. And by the way, what's going on with the Clemson secondary? I think it's funny and worth noting so Clemson played 2 SEC teams this year. Combined, gave up 900 yards plus passing to the 2 quarterbacks, and both of those quarterbacks struggled inside the SEC this year. Both of those teams were middling teams inside the SEC this year. Does Clemson need to worry about their secondary, but can Notre Dame even exploit?
Well, Ian Book, for all the limitations of the Notre Dame offense, Ian Book can get the ball out fast and with accuracy. I mean, he'll move it, and I actually think he's kind of a rough matchup for Clemson in that the problem Clemson had with some of these quarterbacks at the end of the year, particularly Jake Bentley, their whole defense is kind of built around generating pressure, giving you weird looks, and their defensive line was so dominant within the ACC that teams just never had the opportunity to operate, essentially. They couldn't even get the play started, at least not started the way they needed it to be run. And when they played South Carolina is not a good offense. They're not a good offense in the SEC. I'll pull this up as I'm talking, but it was kind of astonishing that really, it was like every play, and I'm looking at it. I mean, yeah, like in terms of, okay, I looked at the wrong stat, but South Carolina would just kind of run a play. Jake Bentley would find a guy, and he'd just throw it, and he'd put it in a tight window or something, sure, but it seems like those windows were always there, and it seemed like if South Carolina just got the ball off, it would go a pretty good chunk of yardage. I think Ian Book we saw this against LSU when he came in the bowl game in place of Wimbush. He's a gamer, and he's going to get the ball out. And as long as he's willing to be aggressive with the football, he'll move the ball and he can score points. I think there's a real concern with Clemson. And, I flagged this last year, as you remember, that Clemson, in my view, had real problems because I didn't think the secondary played the ball in the air well at all. And this year, I think it's gotten worse, partly due to personnel. There may be something to be said that the defense in the secondary has been tested so little that they just really aren't very well practiced, honestly, at being strained. And I do think there's an opportunity there. It's just more a question of whether. And Notre Dame has some phenomenal, Boykin in Book, some great components in a passing game. How much they're going to be able to exploit it.
So let's talk about a game that not a lot of people here currently care a whole lot about, probably, but I think it's somewhat interesting, and there's a rant involved that I probably won't get into. But Ohio State and Washington, I think Ohio State's a double-digit favorite in this game. I think it's 10, 11 points. One of the frustrations I have is with the Big Ten, Pac-12 lock into the Rose Bowl, because what Ohio State tends to do is say that they got the short end of the stick by not making the playoffs. They did this in 2015. So they lost to Michigan State without Connor Cook, which that was a terrible offense. They should have beaten them by 30 points, and then complained that they weren't in the championship. But then, so they do this where they complain about not being in the ship, not being in the playoffs, and then they play an overmatched team in Pasadena, and then we never know how good they could have been or were, or if they were deserving or whatever. Are we going to have that this year? Like, if they beat Washington by 15 points, will we know anything more about Ohio State than we don't know right now?
No, because we really have no idea how good the Pac-12 is or is not. It's just all around college football. It seems like every year people talk about college football is not very good, and it's a down year. We hear that every freaking season, that it's a down year for college football. They're not very good this year, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, and this gets in, like he said, to a bunch of other rants we have. Something to always remember is if college football looks bad, it's only because the other teams in college football made you look bad. It's all sport of football is always relative. If you put 4 or 5 NFL teams in college football, we'd all be talking about how everybody in the college football sucks, but 3 teams, how they're the worst year in college football history because these 4 teams just ran roughshod through the schedule, when it's really just that those 4 teams were, the best teams ever in college. I don't know how good the Pac-12 is. There's signs that they're really not very good. I don't know how good the Big Ten is. There were signs. Everybody forgets the non-conference schedule, just how much the Big Ten struggled. And I'm not trying to hate. The Big Ten struggled really badly. So I don't know what to make of it. I actually think the Pac-12 was probably pretty solid. I just think they didn't have anybody that was really particularly good. There was a lot of basically above average parity in the Pac-12 and nobody that was top level. That's my take on the Pac-12. Probably a lot more parity in a lot of ways than people really realize or give credit for, in that teams like Stanford or Washington State would have been pretty competitive in most conferences and had a decently good record. The problem is they don't have anybody, if you took the top team out of any other conference, from Ohio State or an Alabama or an Oklahoma, they would have probably pretty easily won the Pac-12. They didn't have anybody in that upper tier. And that kind of leads into the ultimate point there, right? That Ohio State, they could thump Washington, and it may not really mean a lot because I think Washington's just not quite on that level. But to people's points in the chat, it could also go the other way. I mean, it would not something you see a lot, and I'm going to sort of pivot here. Maybe we may get a different question, but something I always find interesting is when you see these interconference matchups in bowl games, I think it gets underplayed sometimes how much style of play gives an advantage to one team versus another. For example, Alabama played Washington in the 2016 playoff. Alabama could not throw the ball to save their lives. And now everybody knew Washington had a really good defense, but it's easy to underestimate. Everybody in the Pac-12 throws the ball a lot. And Ohio State shell-shocked Michigan because Michigan hadn't faced anything like them as a passing offense. I don't think Ohio State is going to shell-shock Washington defensively. Washington has seen teams that are, even if they're not as good as Ohio State, teams that are willing to chunk the ball every other play and throw it down the field vertically with accuracy. They've got pretty good quarterbacks in the Pac-12. And that could sort of jar Ohio State in a sense, in that Ohio State is used to having an advantage or sort of coming in and the other team not really being prepared for what they could do offensively. And now they're going to play a defense that is really used to playing up-tempo, vertical, aggressive passing offenses. And sometimes it kind of gives teams fits because they're just not used to having to play that way, or playing against somebody. A lot of times they're not used to playing someone that's used to playing their style of football.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we did see that, that Washington game forced the early exodus of Lane Kiffin. So that was kind of funny. It's also funny that, so this is something, there's not any Washington fans listening to us right now, but there's some commonality there with Hayden Sarkisian, and now he's just, in my opinion, ruining the Falcons. But that's another discussion for another day. Let's see, USC. There's some discussion about USC. I think that Southern Cal can come back around and help the Pac-12. Washington's gonna be good. Washington State can be a consistent 9-3, 10-2 type team. The one they're really missing is between Oregon and UCLA. One of those teams has got to get good if the Pac-12 is going to be viewed better. A boring Utah 8-4, 9-3, potentially winning your conference is not going to do it.
Right. And I mean, the concern for a lot of these conferences is it's layered. The talent level. I think, didn't you give me the stat? Was it 9 players out of the Pac-12 were top 100 last year?
You would have
maybe. Okay, I gave you that stat. Okay, I think it was in 2018. There were 9 top 100 recruits signed in the Pac-12 total last year. Alabama signed 10. The talent gap across that conference is so stark compared to the other conferences at the top that it just creates huge issues. I mean, they can't. Whoever the heck makes it to the playoff, like Washington a couple of years ago, they're not on the same level ever in terms of talent with the major players in the other conferences. And to your point, with UCLA or Oregon, I think they have to be good. And what that's going to have to do is going to have to drive up a sort of, if you want to call it brand awareness, they got to be able to keep those California kids home. And, it looks like, who's it? Kayvon Thibodeau, I think, is the number 1 overall recruit. I believe he's out of California, right? Is he one of the big LA schools? He's probably going to leave the state, and there's a chance he may go to Oregon, but if he doesn't go to Oregon, then he's going to probably leave and go east. And losing kids like that on a regular basis, Najee Harris was a California kid. It's, Tua Tagovailoa out of Hawaii they used to get those kids. I mean, that's destroying the Pac-12, and they've got to get a big enough brand back that they can keep those kids at home. And a lot of that falls on, maybe this is a really interesting topic for our live discussion, how flipping dysfunctional the Pac-12 is with Larry Scott. I don't know if you guys, people in chat, follow this whole story, but it is an absolute clown show circus what is going on right now in the Pac-12 between their TV contracts, the officiating scandals. I mean, it's an absolute disaster.
Yeah, there's an article, and we'll post it, we'll tweet it later. You and I both read that just sort of uncovered how much of a disaster the Pac-12 is right now under his leadership. But I mean, it's I don't think there's a better summary of how bad things are than a challenge being reviewed or a play being reviewed, and a guy who has no experience in officiating making a phone call from his living room to say, "Hey, this is how this call should go." That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I don't think he was from his living room. He was actually in the problem is that he was in the officiating booth, but he's the it's like the general counsel for the Pac-12. I want to be careful with my words here because the situation with some of it, but if you look up the history of some of the guys in leadership positions in the Pac-12 and who they were and how they got there, one of the things that's concerning to me in the world I live in, I don't see how they're qualified. They've got guys, that guy's a counsel for the guy in question was a counsel for the Pac-12. He had been I don't think he ever made partner at a national firm, was briefly with an NFL organization and transferred over. And you've got him on a $600,000 salary. And your $600,000 in-house position as counsel for a conference, you can have anybody you want in a job like that. And I think his name's Wilson. I think David Wilson, I want to say is his name. I mean, I'm sure he's a nice guy. I don't. That's why I'm not want to say too much out of turn. I don't know enough about him. I'm not a journalist. But what I was looking at in terms of credentials, from my outsider's view, I feel like a $600K law job is a big flipping deal. There are not many of those. And it seems like you should be able to get a rock star in that position with a tremendous amount of experience running something at a conference level. And they got somebody that had zero experience really in terms of his ability to, operate or run a conference infrastructure. His experience was a little bit in an NFL organization, just a couple of years. And then in terms of Larry Scott, I think he's making, I want to say he's drawing a $6 million salary. And they can't get they have a Pac-12 network that they can't get on any major publication front. They keep trying to get it on DirecTV and failing. It's completely incompetent leadership from the top down. There's a video where Larry Scott had sent his employees announcing that he was getting a raise. And it was, the way it was phrased was essentially, I'm really excited to let you know that in terms of how they viewed us and our vision, that the Pac-12 Conference of Administrators and Athletic Directors have seen fit to give me a raise. And in doing so, what they're showing is their respect for what we've been able to accomplish and their faith and trust in the vision that you've been helping me affect for the Pac-12. And he's like giddy to talk about how he just got a $6 million raise to people that are not probably, because I've read articles about it, are sharing flats in San Francisco because they can barely afford rent with 4 roommates. Just the tone deaf, ridiculous nature of it. It's just, it is utterly incredible. And I cannot overestimate or overstate to people how much of an utter catastrophe they're bordering on right now in the Pac-12 and how much they need a complete change of leadership before and if that doesn't happen, we can talk about teams all we want in football and Washington State, what they need to improve. I mean, their brand identity is so bad right now, and the lack of exposure on television, as long as that's the case and you can't watch a Pac-12 game on TV, none of this stuff's ever going to change.
Yeah, and that's why I think, wrapping this Pac-12 discussion up, because we probably lost a lot of people, I think one of your name brands, UCLA, Oregon, USC, has got to find a way back to national relevance. People have been trying to make USC a thing. It's not going to be a thing. Until they do something like Alabama, and that's what's funny. Like Alabama beat them 52-6 or whatever a couple of years ago to open the season, and they won the Rose Bowl. And people were talking about putting them in the playoffs, and I'm like, "Are you? You cannot be serious." But yeah, I think. I do think the Pac-12 is kind of on the verge right now. It is a leadership issue, but it's also, they've kind of missed their window. they missed their window. They had teams that were bad at the wrong time, and now you've got a lot of Southern schools and a lot of Big Ten schools that are killing them in recruiting. And I don't know. So let's circle back away from the Pac-12 a little bit and talk about let's see so we talked earlier about 8 playoff teams, and a discussion I heard earlier today, and I think it's a good one, is and you sort of touched on this. I think they've got to find a way to get the bowls away from the playoffs. And I know it doesn't make sense financially for the NCAA to allow it, but the fact that you've got kids playing, let's say Georgia, Oklahoma last year, they played in the Rose Bowl. They played that game in the opening round, and it was the Rose Bowl. But then they also had a Rose Bowl. It's very confusing. And I think it's ridiculous. It's awkward. It's clunky. And you don't want to have bowl game type fanfare and things to do where you go do the charity events and the hot dog eating contests and all this crap when there's a playoff game to be played. And so I think if we expand the playoffs and we have to still keep the bowls in, it's watering down the historical relevancy of the Rose Bowl and the Sugar Bowl to play the Sugar Bowl twice. So, Josh, what do you think about that? Do you think do you think they need to get away from that? And 2, is there ever a way that that's ever going to happen?
It's difficult because I think you talk about watering it down. The biggest thing that's watering it down is honestly that these teams are playing in the playoff in the first place and they're not playing in major bowls. That you have when you put 4 teams in the playoff, and when you're, like this year you'd have Notre Dame and you'd have Oklahoma playing in a major bowl. All of a sudden, though, every matchup gets better. We talked about the SEC getting bumped up slots. That bumps everybody down a slot, so to speak. And every bowl looks better and more interesting at that point. Every bowl's got a better team in it. I think there's definitely something to be said for the fact that when what does the Rose Bowl mean relative to the playoff? I think if you move the bowls away from the playoffs, I don't think that really fixes that problem. I think what you're seeing is a criticism a lot of people had for the playoff structure to begin with, which is it was always going to dilute and unempower the major bowls. It's going to make them less interesting. It's going to mean winning the Rose Bowl is not a big deal anymore. It used to be a big deal to win the Rose Bowl, and people hung banners on how many Rose Bowls they won. You're not going to see that. And the committee and the NCAA in general, to sort of placate that fact and to placate the criticism of people saying, if you move to this playoff structure, the whole bowl idea, which is unique to college football, and the experience of being able to say you won X bowl would go away. They said, oh, well, the playoffs are really just an extension of the bowls. They're just the upper tier bowls rebranded, basically. And it's not really how this has worked out. To your point about having it, you were talking about earlier about having the 16 playoff and having some of them on home campuses. I'm not really opposed to that. I think one of the interesting things, if you did 16 playoffs, is you'd almost have the playoffs going concurrently with all the bowls. You'd have to spread it out over the length of bowl season. So you'd have some playoff, the early seeds early into mid-December, and then you'd have some other bowls, the first major round into December, and then, maybe into January. But I don't think there's any solution that isn't going to dilute the bowls. It's just the reality of the fact that you're not playing for the Rose Bowl, you're playing for the playoff, and that the teams the Rose Bowl or the Sugar Bowl do get now are just not as good as they used to be.
So the comment, there's a comment about if Notre Dame was actually in a conference, they would have lost to Clemson. I agree, but what if they're in the Pac-12? They'd probably beat Washington. I can't knock Notre Dame. They play 10 Power 5 teams. This year they scheduled teams like Virginia Tech, Florida State. They play Southern Cal and Stanford every year. It's not Notre Dame's fault, y'all. It's not Notre Dame's fault. Yes, they sat at home. They sat at home when everybody was playing conference championship games, but at one point during the season, Clemson was playing FCS. Alabama was playing FCS. Ohio State was playing Rutgers or Oregon State, and Notre Dame was playing a name team that they genuinely tried to schedule that was good, and they just didn't pan out. So in most years, Notre Dame's schedule is hard enough for them to either be eliminated from the playoffs because they weren't good enough, or to earn their way in. So I can't really be mad about Notre Dame not being in a conference.
I've always thought the conference thing's a little overblown. I mean, they play more Power 5 teams than anybody else does. And I get the conference championship discussion, but I do think sometimes it's funny to me how much people talk hypocritically about that one way or the other. You'll hear SEC fans that'll say, well, Alabama should be in even if they lose the conference championship game because they played a hard schedule. And then they turn around and say, well, but Notre Dame doesn't even play a conference championship. They shouldn't be in. You can't play that both ways. Either you admit that the conference championship game is an extra data point, in which case you should not punish Notre Dame for it. Or if you're saying that the conference championship is required, then you should be admitting that Alabama should not be able to get in with it. I think what Notre Dame does is it points out the fact that people talk out of both sides of their mouths on that issue. And again, like a Big Ten fan saying Alabama shouldn't be in, Alabama should not be in if they don't win the conference championship game. You got to be a conference champion. Okay, but if they don't win the conference championship game, then why does that make them worse than Notre Dame who didn't play in one? I don't fault Notre Dame really for not playing in a conference. This year, they had a weak schedule. They did. It's not their fault. It could have happened if they were in a conference like the ACC. Or more importantly, if they were in the Pac-12, would their schedule have been any harder? To your point, I don't know that it would have been. It just so happens the scattering of big name teams they had happened to all suck in the same year. It's just going to happen sometimes to a schedule. Nothing you can do about it. But they schedule aggressively. So
now, yeah, my point to that, and our point really all year has been, I'm not blaming them for not being in a conference, and I'm not blaming them for their schedule. And this is where a lot of Notre Dame fans get off the bus with me, is I am blaming them for having, I think it was 4 games against teams that didn't make a bowl this year where they were within 1 score. I can't get my arms around. I think if you consistently struggle with these middling teams, at some point that has to add up to being viewed as a loss. Like, no, it's not a loss, and a win is a win is a win, and I get that. But elite playoff teams are to be judged differently than a team that had a nice year like Texas A&M. You win 8-4, that's great. We're not going to beat you up for struggling with Purdue. Maybe I shouldn't use Purdue. Maybe that's a bad example. But
yeah, Clemson man in the comments made the statement, you can't fall over backwards and go 12-0. Sometimes you can. And I mean, not super strong, but right with this season, once Notre Dame beat Michigan, they had to screw up decently good. I mean, they had to lose. I made this point to somebody recently that last I checked, Purdue, which everybody makes fun of Ohio State for losing to Purdue was 37th in S&P, okay? And if you look at now Notre Dame's schedule, they've played 2 teams better than Purdue, Stanford and Michigan. Purdue is in S&P pretty close to Stanford, and they're better than Syracuse, okay? Better than USC that they beat by 1 touchdown. So everybody loves to laugh at Ohio State for losing to Purdue, but Notre Dame only had really 3 or 4 chances to lose to even a Purdue. And to Daniel's point, in terms of evaluating them, I absolutely have to point out the fact that, yeah, that 7-point win over Southern Cal is about the same as a 7-point win over Purdue. It's actually worse. And when you look at how utterly weak the schedule was from that perspective, you really ought to be dominating it, because they only really had, in my opinion, 4 top 65 teams the entire schedule. That's only 4 games you should realistically be able to lose as even a top 20 team. It's difficult not to go undefeated with that schedule.
Yeah, and Clemson, man, winning does matter, and that's why they're in the playoffs. But is it fair to say winning matters when 2012 Notre Dame had no business being on the same field as Alabama, and there were teams that Alabama struggled with and lost to that year. 2012 Texas A&M would have beaten Notre Dame just as bad. 2012 Georgia would have beaten Notre Dame just as bad. It's different when we're talking about elite teams. Elite teams beat 6-6 teams all the time like they stole something. And you consistently struggle with them, that's a problem. Now, that doesn't mean Notre Dame's a bad team, but we're saying, are they good enough to be one of the 4 best teams in the country? I think going 12-0 with a 10-game Power 5 schedule, you've got to at least be in discussion, if not be, in there. They couldn't help their schedule. The 2012, somebody said they fell over backwards in 2012 to undefeated season. They didn't, and somebody did correct them and say OU. That OU game, they did score a little bit late, but that was a big win for Notre Dame. That was a really good win, and I think this year, either Syracuse or Michigan was a good win. It was kind of ugly. They did mostly dominate that, but Syracuse or Stanford would probably be that kind of equivalent win this year, where they won pretty big against a decent, not great team, but actually showed themselves to be dominant.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I'm hoping somebody brings up a different question here. Not that I can go too much longer, but again, Georgia's strength of schedule this year was 11th. The resume S&P rank was 3rd. Notre Dame, when everything was said and done, strength of schedule was 61st. Resume S&P plus was 10th. There is very little reason to believe that, for example, Georgia would not have gone undefeated with Notre Dame's schedule, frankly. You can make an argument back and forth on Georgia and Michigan, though I think most people would think Georgia would probably win that game, and quite possibly more than Notre Dame did. But for the remainder of that schedule, without having played any top 25 team, based off what Georgia did this year, I think it would be extremely unlikely Georgia would have lost any other game with Notre Dame's schedule, and they would have probably been a lot more convincing against it. That's both of our concern.
Okay, so let's circle back. Let's talk a little bit about Jalen in the Georgia game. I know we try to stay away from a ton of Alabama. We haven't talked that much Alabama this time. I thought, like everybody else, that was an amazing performance. What's interesting to me, and we're going to get into this in our preview, but what's interesting to me is what happens if Tua can't go against Oklahoma, because we said last year that Alabama was better equipped to play and possibly steamroll Oklahoma than they were to beat Georgia or Clemson. Are we kind of looking at the same team this year with Jalen-led offense versus Tua?
I think probably so. Tua, let's be clear here. Alabama's not going to score more points with Jalen, I think, than with Tua in those circumstances, assuming Tua's reasonably healthy, because Tua is so good. But we've talked about before that in some ways Alabama could be more dominant with Jalen Hurts than they can with Tua if your defense is below a certain mark. Because with Jalen, if you're not at a certain level, you can't deal with Alabama's run game and deal with Jalen as a quarterback, as a runner. And it's easy to forget the 2016 season as a freshman, Alabama broke a lot of their scoring records that they'd set in 2014 with Jalen Hurts as a quarterback. A lot of their single season scoring and yardage records were broken. And we were super critical of Alabama that year because we didn't feel like the offense was going to scale. And turns out, as much as Alabama fans hated hearing that from us all year, they ended up at the end of the year talking about how smart we were, because it ended up being proven true, which is something we try to do a lot. It's easy to forget when they played teams that didn't have good defenses, though, how good they were and how unstoppable they were. They're all around better offensively by a good margin than that 2016 team was. I still would have loved to see that 2016 team with a Tua quarterback just to see how good one football team could be, because that defense combined with a real quarterback would have been an incredible historical data point. But yeah, I think Alabama with Jalen Hurts at quarterback, if Tua wasn't able to go, I mean, Alabama, one thing I'll say about the SEC championship game, in Alabama, as much as statistically they were getting beaten pretty good at the half and even halfway through the third quarter, I think sometimes people are sort of missing the point that Alabama scored 35 against Georgia. That's a lot of points. 35 points in a ball game. If you score 30 plus, you usually end up winning in most college football games in most major conferences. Alabama with a banged up quarterback having a, quote, very bad day, and Jalen coming in put up 35 against a top 5 defense. I just don't see any way, if that's true, that Oklahoma is even going to be able to remotely stop Alabama from scoring 40 plus. And with Jalen at quarterback, even they may score 50 or 60. And like you said, if Tua was completely healthy, you kind of think they could probably score 70.
Yeah, and the thing that should concern Alabama fans is Oklahoma's offense is going to score enough that it's going to put pressure on Alabama's offense to step up, and that's why this game is scarier for Alabama than a Notre Dame would have been, because Alabama knows when they play Notre Dame that Notre Dame ain't scoring 30, and Alabama's probably going to score in the 30s. With Oklahoma, you know they're going to score a lot of points, which means if this is why everybody says defense travels. If you're going to have a bad day, it's possible to have a bad day on your team. It's going to come from the offense. It just takes a couple of drives to get out of sync to where, boom, you look up and it's the third quarter and you got 10 points. So, and I think that's kind of what happened against Georgia. So I think there's a legitimate concern there, but I also think that Oklahoma's defense is so bad, so historically bad, and it's not just from playing good offenses, that it may not be an issue at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we haven't done our model yet or really formulated our projections, and the model really does kind of help. We're not controlled by it, but it helps guide us in terms of sort of making clear what are reasonable opinions we had and what opinions maybe we need to second guess. But as of today, right now, it's hard pressed for me to think Oklahoma's going to keep pace. Just because their defense is going to struggle so badly, and Alabama's defense, you would think, is good enough that they'll be able to slow them down. But I know we had this conversation. We've had this discussion in our show at some point. I know what would be the hardest matchup for Alabama, and my answer has always been Oklahoma, between all the teams that might have ended up being number 4. And the reason for that is I talk about we don't know how good Oklahoma is going to scale. That goes both ways. And maybe that Oklahoma could score just as many points against Alabama as they have everybody else. Maybe the defense doesn't even matter. Maybe their ceiling is that high. If that's the case, then, Alabama, like to your point, they may be able to outscore Notre Dame, even in Notre Dame playing a good team, but they could more or less outplay Oklahoma and still manage to lose in a shootout if Oklahoma is able to score 40 or 50 points. Anytime somebody scores 40 points, they have a chance to win.
People are saying, well, how do you stop Oklahoma if you can't stop Georgia? You need to remember that. So Tua got hurt early. Georgia had 2 short field touchdown drives, so 2 that were like 50 yards or less, because Alabama's offense was struggling. Alabama's offense is not going to go 3 and out against Oklahoma more than once in this game, I don't think. I just don't think
it was 28 points too. It's not like they gave up.
Yeah, they scored 7 points in the entire second half and went 6 straight drives without converting a third down. So I'll also say this: the offenses were different. So Jake Fromm had one of the best games of his career. He was out of his mind good. And they have running backs that can match Alabama's physicality, where I think Oklahoma has an offensive line that can match Alabama's physicality, but they don't have running backs.
And let's not pretend like Georgia is some second-rate offense, okay? In S&P Plus, your top 4 offenses in order are Oklahoma 1, Alabama 2, Georgia 3, Ohio State 4. And Georgia is right behind Alabama in S&P in offense. And I get Oklahoma is almost a touchdown better than anybody else, but Georgia is like clear-cut number 3 overall offense in the country. So for people to say, if you can't stop Georgia, how are you going to stop Oklahoma? Well, ignoring Alabama, Georgia is the next best offense in the country than Oklahoma, and they scored 28 points. So if Oklahoma is, like S&P would suggest, 10 points better, maybe they score 35-38. Alabama's going to probably score 40 plus. So Oklahoma wouldn't win with that kind of a margin.
Yeah, I think Oklahoma inching up towards upper 30s is in this game. They have to be. I do not see. I mean, look at what Alabama. And again, this is a healthy Tua, but Alabama had 45 through 3 quarters against A&M. That's a much better defense. It's so hard to talk about because it's so unprecedented. Not just Alabama, but with offenses in general in college football. But Alabama put up 39 and 3 quarters against Missouri. That's a better defense than Oklahoma. And if you want to say Oklahoma's defense is just rated poorly because they play better offenses, Ole Miss, the worst SEC defense I've ever seen, went in and gave up 27 to Texas Tech, who scored 46 on Oklahoma. West Virginia only scored 40 on Tennessee, who is a really bad defense this year, gave up 50 3 times in the SEC. They scored 56 on Oklahoma. So, and it's not just teams balling out and making great throws. Some of it is that. Will Grier had a good game. But if you saw Texas Tech in that second half with their backup quarterback, he was just keeping the ball and running off tackle. And they couldn't stop him. Oklahoma cannot tackle. And this is not, and this is another thing we talked about last week. Everybody's saying, well, Oklahoma surprised Alabama in 2013. Oklahoma had the 24th ranked defense in the country that year. And they slowed down Alabama's crappy offense. Alabama had a pretty
and I plan to talk about this a little bit too when we discuss that game, but everybody forgets Alabama was -4 in the turnover margin in that game too. It was a little more nuanced than just Oklahoma out physicaling them. Alabama was down 1 possession at the end of the game and got strip sacked in a game where they turned the ball over 5 times. Oklahoma certainly won that game and deserved to win it, but Oklahoma was also a really good team. They got a tremendous number of breaks that Alabama generated in that game, and they still had to pull it out at the very end. But yeah, to your point, I'll interject and let you get back to it. But Arkansas and Tennessee are the 2 teams that bracket Oklahoma in the rankings, defensive rankings in S&P. Alabama scored 65 and 58 points in those 2 games. In both those games, they had completely shut it down by about halfway through the third quarter and could have easily scored 70 plus in either one of those games. Tua did not throw a pass, did not play a snap in the fourth quarter of either game. So if Oklahoma is indeed a level of defense as in Arkansas or Tennessee, and I understand, remember, he was healthy against Arkansas, but he was not healthy against Tennessee. That would indicate that Alabama can score 70 against Oklahoma. Realistically.
Trevor Knight did play a perfect game in that. The Trevor Knight, it's so funny because he made a throw when he was playing for A&M against Alabama. He made a throw in the first half against Alabama, a touchdown throw that was reminiscent of how he played against Oklahoma. He never played like that anywhere else ever again. He was a running quarterback for A&M and not a great passer. Somebody said that would Sumlin have had more success at Texas A&M had they stayed in the Big 12? I don't think so. I think, and you kind of have historically agreed with me on this, Sumlin is overrated. And look at what happened to Arizona. I mean, they were terrible this year. I just don't think he's a good football coach. And I think in the Big 12, look, he had a good year or a couple years with Johnny Manziel, but he didn't have a good year against crappy defenses, even with Kyler Murray. So I can't get on board with that.
Yeah, I was responding to a comment. Wesley Batson was asking how many 4-star and 5-star guys from Oklahoma's defense do you not think they can step up the way Georgia defense did? I just want to point out how many are on the defense. Not remotely as many as are on Georgia's. I think I did the math before this. Last year, the Big 12 signed 12 top 100 players. Again, Alabama signed 10, and I think Georgia signed more than Alabama did, or about the same number. It's not even close.
Look, if Oklahoma beats Alabama, it's not because their defense steps up. Maybe it's because they get an explosive play, a defensive score like that. They did get 2 scores against West Virginia. If Oklahoma beats Alabama, it's because they score 56, 59, 60 kind of points. Because defensively, look, they haven't stepped up all season. They got 40 to Kansas. They have really been bad. And Army, they only gave up 21 to Army, and that was the one kind of shining
that was
light.
a flip
Army,
side. That's a flip side thing because Army spent over 12 minutes on one possession at one point in that game. Army made sure, I think they both got like 6 or 7 possessions the entire game. So neither team scored that much because Army shortened that game to an absolutely absurd degree.
Yeah, Kyler Murray at A&M right now would be interesting with Jimbo Fisher's offense. Obviously, I love seeing him in Lincoln Riley's offense, but that would be interesting.
To your point a minute ago, and we talked about this earlier in this discussion, that A&M in 2012, what they had offensively, I'm trying to remember the receiving core. They had Swope, who failed the concussion test but would have been an NFL receiver. Mike Evans, the freshman, was actually like the 4th guy on the depth chart. I think Kennedy was there at that point. Again, you had the top both offensive tackles were the top tackle taken in the draft. I think both may have gone number 1. I know at least one did, I think. And you had another first-round tackle playing guard or center. They had multiple guys taking the first 3 rounds in the defense that year, and you had a Heisman winning quarterback. I mean, team was flipping stacked, and they still managed to lose 2 games. I still am kind of amazed that A&M team did not win the SEC because that was probably the most talented team honestly, the most talented team in Texas A&M history. And they had a phenomenal offensive coordinator, and they still couldn't win it. But the thing I've always seen with Sumlin is it seems like he has a pretty decently interesting system, and he doesn't really teach fundamentals. And you could watch – I think sometimes you see these coaches that are very smart, capable, driven coaches, and they come in and they install their offense, and that's their focus. And they'll come in, and when you follow a guy like Sherman, you've got all these fundamentals that have been coached up for your team, and you're phenomenal because you're spending all your practice time taking these guys that already know how to block and tackle, and you're saying, all right, we're going to work on how to make you guys as a unit run this offense. And they get really good at running that offense. The problem is in 2 years, all that time you spent running that offense did not teach the backups or the third string how to block and tackle. So you watch the program completely implode. I think it's what happened at Auburn after the 2010 team with Cam Newton came in, win the national title, and then by 2012, it's one of the worst Auburn teams ever. And I think it's because Goss Malzahn and everything that was going on there with Chizik, they had no contact practices and all these other things. They were really great about installing the offense, but they were horrendous at actually teaching people how to play college football, and it takes years to show up. And I said this before, and I've heard this a number of times now that I can say it with enough confidence. Kevin Sumlin has some personal issues he probably needs to work through, and I'm not shocked that he's not having success right now. I don't think it's a massive reflection on him that he's not being successful beyond the fact that he needs to take some time off from football and sort of re-gear himself before he can step back into things to be successful the way he needs to be.
Wesley said he's interested with the Kentucky-Penn State game.
Well, that makes one person.
I'm interested too.
Okay, 2.
But I'm interested too, but for some reason, I just think it's a horrible matchup for Kentucky. But then I look at Michigan, who just romped Penn State, and Michigan's a similar. Michigan fans don't want to hear this, but they're a similar team to Kentucky. They've got a better quarterback than Kentucky, but I'm not sure they have a better offense. If you watch that Michigan-Ohio State game, it bothered me how basic that offense was, how bog standard vanilla. We talked about how what really put Ohio State in trouble was a lot of motion, a lot of exploiting bad angles. Michigan's offense was super basic, and that's the kind of offense that Kentucky's got, and Michigan rolled Penn State. So I think a lot of people, including myself, feel like at first glance, Trace McSorley's gonna have a day, and they're gonna beat Kentucky. Everybody's saying Kentucky's overrated because of the brand name. Is it possible that we're reading this wrong?
Yeah. I don't know that you are. Penn State, we talked about a lot this year, and I have a lot of my in-laws, some of which I think my wife may be listening to this. So, if I stop communicating, maybe Daniel knows where to send help. We were not super thrilled with Penn State this year. We thought they really disappointed, and I don't think either one of us thought they were a particularly good team. I think they had one relatively good game against Ohio State, where Ohio State was still in sputter mode. And, I just don't have a lot of confidence in them. And the way that several teams, like I think Illinois at one point, were able to run the ball in Ohio State, Penn State, not Ohio State, with a good amount of success, it really troubles me against Kentucky. Michigan was able to as well. None of those teams are good offenses, and they had a lot of success. Kentucky can probably be one-dimensional and move the ball quite well in Penn State. And then Kentucky's been susceptible against the run and the pass at times. Georgia killed them running the ball, but most everybody else has killed them by throwing it. But I personally kind of think the teams that gave Kentucky any sort of problems were much better passing teams. I will also say Kentucky's defense the last several games clearly ran out of depth. Against Georgia in particular, they had a couple guys go out with injury. And a team like Kentucky, they've got basically one layer of starters. And if you lose two linebackers, your defense could be completely crippled. If they get a little healthier over the case of the bowl, I think that could be one that really surprises a lot of people, where Kentucky's able to control the game. Now, I'll say, by the way, I'm going to have to. We're already about to 11:30 here. I'm in Eastern time, so I'm running out of time. Though I can talk for just a little bit longer.
All right, we'll go.
I can do 10 minutes.
All right, what do you think about Ryan Day taking over?
I don't have a ton of thoughts at this point. I haven't done enough there's a reason we only do so many shows and we don't talk about certain teams sometimes. I like to try to deep dive before I go in too far with opinions. I don't think I will say at the onset, he's not going to be Urban Meyer, because as much as a lot of SEC fans like to rag him, Urban Meyer was a really freaking good coach. And I think he was flawed in certain ways. And I think it's really unreasonable at this point, because we compare everybody to Nick Saban, who at this point has to be said to be one of the best of all time. Urban Meyer, if Nick Saban wasn't there, Urban Meyer, probably wins the title in 2009. And you're talking about a multi-national title. It already is a multinational title winning coach, but he would have won even more. Ryan Day is not going to be on Urban Meyer's level either, both as a coach and probably as a recruiter. But he's still probably going to be very, very good. And the current issue really is, in that region, Ohio State is still the dominant force. And as long as that's true, they're going to get their lion's share of recruits. Michigan seems to be the fact that Michigan kind of shot their wad and didn't make it this year, and doesn't help them. Nobody else in the Big Ten is really an immediate threat. Ohio State's going to be plenty fine for years to come.
Yeah, and I think that Michigan needs to worry a little bit, because I think – so here's the thing. Michigan needs to find a way to take advantage in recruiting, because Ryan Day, for all I think that he's a good coach, it seems like he's a good game day coach, especially a preparation coach, especially given what, getting thrown in the fire the way he did. There's an opportunity to get some recruiting advantage and take advantage of Meyer being gone. Michigan's got to do it now, because if they don't find a way to beat Ohio State in the next year or two, it's going to set their program way back, because they're going to end up firing Harbaugh, and it's just going to be, I feel like, some just bad juju around that program.
Yeah. I don't know. I agree with it. I agree with it.
And while you're looking at whatever you're looking up, I hate giving Colin Cowherd credit, but he called the Urban Meyer retiring like a month ago. And he's a big Harbaugh guy for whatever reason. And I just thought it was just him sort of giving a nod to his buddy or whatever, but he called it. So kudos to him for that.
Yeah, I'm not shocked that Urban Meyer retired, but I am surprised. I didn't think it would happen. I don't know if that means that he's going to want to look at something else later or whatnot, but I will say my short piece on him, having watched and sort of tried to study him, and especially if you try to study look into his wife and what she does and how he's interacted with his family and his past history with his father, I think Urban Meyer is a phenomenal coach, but he's almost too driven, and he truly can't handle losing. He's so determined to win, and his identity is wrapped around winning. And it's interesting to me, the dichotomy with Saban, who's managed to get to this point. You talk about the process, or Alabama fans do. His whole mindset is about building this machine, and he doesn't even really care about winning or losing so much as, is his machine perfectly run? And Meyer, on the other hand, from what I've seen, cares tremendously about winning and losing. And what that's allowed is Saban sort of bounces back and adapts and sort of is more stable. Meyer can hit these higher highs, but sustainability is a real struggle with his attitude and approach. Oh, thanks Nick Saban. We'll be more positive for Alabama for the rest of the
year. We absolutely will. Thanks. It's much appreciated. Somebody mentioned losing Dax Hill won't be good for the Michigan recruitment. That was a crazy one. And this, I don't know, we don't do a lot of recruiting discussion, but talk a little bit, go a couple minutes on what you think about the early signing period and how it's potentially impacting things.
In the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure it really matters that much. I mean, every kid is going to sign more or less. They're just signing earlier instead of later. Personally, I think it's probably bad for the kids and the teams to a certain extent. It's disrupting the bowl schedule for most major teams. Everybody's having it go out and recruit hard right now because they got to get kids locked up. And the reason I said it's bad for the kids, a lot of these teams that are signing kids right now are going to have different coaches, frankly, in February or March. And I know teams already held off coaches hiring and firing until after February. But you see things like I'm trying to think all the different moves. I think Georgia lost a defensive coordinator, right? Alabama just lost their offensive coordinator. Sorry, I'm not quite as up to speed as I probably should be. Coaching moves all over the place. Ohio State loses a coach in Urban Meyer, and then Day's not quite settled, and they're all getting really shook up, but they're also trying to get kids signed in this early period, so they're locked in and they're at a disadvantage. And then these teams they're going to go to be signed, I don't want to go to this school because they've lost their defensive coordinator. They're going to sign with some other school who's going to change coaches the next month. It makes it that much earlier in the process, gives kids that much less time to form an opinion and locks kids in earlier. It's beneficial to a certain degree, I guess, just so that kids can kind of wrap things up and get the distractions out of the way. But I think it's kind of stupid and pointless when high school playoffs are already over. If they wanted to sign and get this locked up, if you had an early signing period in August where you could go into your senior year and already know where you're going, and if you get injured, you are guaranteed a scholarship, I think that would have been more beneficial for the high school athletes. But December versus February, I mean, come on. I don't think it really does them any favors.
So, and this can be our last discussion point. Vincent brought up the Mack Brown to North Carolina hire.
Oh, my God.
Can you join me in saying that this is going to be an absolute disaster, but really fun to
watch? I mean, I thought the Herm Edwards thing was going to be a disaster based off the psychotic press conferences. His athletic director is actually his former agent. It was a crazy, crazy press conferences they gave when they hired him. But no, Mack Brown.
Didn't he just hire?
Yeah, he did. He hired Longo.
Somebody that we've hated all year. Oh, y'all, Ole Miss had like the number one offense in the country out of conference. They scored 19 points per game in SEC play, and that's including playing teams like Arkansas and Texas A&M. So, yeah, it's going to be
I will say maybe his offense does better when they're – and I'm trying to say this with a way that's not being rude, but I guess I'll just say it. The ACC defenses are not as good as the SEC defenses, and maybe his offense will translate better in the ACC where they can be more wide open. But realistically, the transition from – do you remember the name? The guy that was at Ole Miss before Longo? I'm blanking on it. Farmer? No. Yep, I'm blanking. But the drop off when they hired Longo a couple of years ago has just been stark. And that combined with Mac Brown, who seems to have watching him, I will say at least it gets him off ESPN because, oh my God, he never had any idea what was going on. Do you remember when he left that broadcast early that the game goes into overtime and he literally turns to his co-anchor on air and says, well, looks like this is going late, but I got to catch a flight. So, all right, I'll see you guys later. And he just left.
And the thing is, he's been in these like coaches' room broadcasts during games. And his analysis is so like empty one-liner platitudes. It's like he's coaching from old movies and just whatever he's seen that got a rise out of people. I can't wait to watch this. Some of these terrible coaching hires are going to end up being a lot of fun. I guess for everybody that's not a fan of these teams.
Yeah, well, and I'm assuming there are no North Carolina football fans on here because that would require there to be North Carolina football fans. But yeah, now the Mac Brown analysis, just good old boy, and you just got to put him in and win, and you just got to stick with what's working. And I know the run's not working right now, but that's your identity. And I think these boys got a lot of heart, and they'll make it work. It's like they haven't run for 3 yards the entire game, and they're throwing for 10. So every throw. So I don't really know what you expect them to do, Mac. I mean, it's just like bizarre, completely detached, unaware. If they talk about a call during the game or some decision, there's like a complete lack of awareness or understanding. Yeah, it'll be special.
Somebody mentioned Larry Fedora. I think Fedora was a far, far better coach.
I'm surprised Fedora worked out so poorly, honestly. I thought
he didn't for a while.
True. I mean, I thought he was a pretty good coach. And I think, there were a lot of stuff on it. I'm not going to say you got a bad rap, but with the academic scandal situation and then the Sneakergate stuff, there's just so much disruption in North Carolina. I almost wonder if Fedora's going to go somewhere else, land on his feet, and be successful. And we're going to kind of look back on this and wonder if it was really external factors that made North Carolina the problem it has been, where he was never able to really get things settled.
Yeah, and maybe this was just them wanting a fair, clean break from that. But you can't hire Mac Brown. I mean, some of these retreads are really bad. Okay. I said this was the last thing, but this is going to be the last thing. Kansas State fans mad about hiring a guy who's 67-6 and currently 13-0 really baffles me because I don't want to say this rudely, but it's Manhattan, Kansas, y'all. I mean, outside of Bill Snyder, what has Kansas State done? I thought they would be over the moon about this hire. I think he would be successful at a lot of really good Power 5 programs, and it's a lot better than Les Miles or Mac Brown, in my opinion.
What Kleiman? I don't actually know how to pronounce it, but what he built at North Dakota State is incredible. If you haven't really followed it, I mean, they're a hard-nosed team. They're well coached. They have a good system. Year in and year out, they play good football. They beat FBS teams sometimes when they've played them, just simply because they're so daggum well coached and they're a good football team. And something I comment on a lot when you watch bad teams, like bad Group of 5 teams or FCS teams, there's a pretty stark difference between a team that just isn't that talented or athletic and teams that aren't very good at football. If you've got a guy wide open streaking down the field, do you have a system that allows you to, does your quarterback recognize it and can you complete the throw? Because you can score on anybody if they bust coverage. North Dakota State always executes at a high level. And to your point, Kansas State does not have a lot going for them. They don't have much talent in the area. That's why they rely on junior college players. It's sort of a unique set of problems. And Chris Kleiman is a guy that's going to have them coached up to be a good football team that's well balanced. He's going to try to find talent to fit his system. I don't really see how you could ever expect to do better than that. It's about as good a hire as you could get if you got a guy that was better, you're not going to be able to keep him. And you're never going to have you're just never going to have the talent to be that much more successful, honestly, at Kansas State, as much as they don't want to hear it.
Yeah, he did inherit a bit of a machine at North Dakota State, but it wasn't like, and this is one thing where I think a lot of people sort of slight Les Miles' career at LSU because Saban kind of teed it up for him. He still had to keep it going. LSU was an elite program under Les Miles, and Les Miles proved to be a good coach. I don't like when people say, because how many times have we seen a coach take a Ferrari and turn it into a Pinto? Larry Coker is a perfect example. I mean, he inherited a great program and it went south within 2 years. I'm kind of blanking right now, but there's a bunch of others that it's happened to. And I honestly think that you got to give credit where it's due when winning traditions.
Yeah,
continue.
well, yeah, Larry Coker at Miami, and then I think every Miami fan in the world cringed a little bit when Manny Diaz just announced that he's leaving or took that head coaching job at Temple, because I've never seen that program seemed to have skyrocketed to, they thought they were going to win the national title. And within 12 months, now I think most Miami fans are concerned if they're going to, or are already expecting to fire Mark Richt next year. Like
it's kind of. I'm surprised Manny Diaz got that job, but the defense was the only thing holding Miami together. I am really worried about Mark Richt down there. I thought he was going to be a nice 8-4, 9-3 kind of guy down there, but in a down year in the ACC, and you go like 6-6 or whatever they did this year, you can't do that. All right, I think you're losing steam. You got anything else you want to add to this as we wind it down?
I don't think so. I think we just kind of wanted to ramble, touch base with people. Obviously, we got the new branding. We'd love comments or feedback on it. We're obviously going to do bowl previews, so you don't even have to ask for them. It's going to come. If there's stuff, always something that's useful to us. If there's stuff you guys want to see in those previews, let us know. We got our Twitter account you can hit us up on. Follow us on Twitter and comment. Daniel will always mix it up with you guys in the comments. I mix it up quite a bit too. You never know which one of us you're going to get. If you like the comment, it's me, and if you don't like it, it's Daniel. But otherwise, we'll be getting more content to you throughout the season.
Yeah, and that's why we did the live show, because we generally go kind of radio silent until playoff time, but we've enjoyed the season. I thought it was good to hop on a live one. I didn't expect even the 50 people that watched it to watch it, given the holidays and stuff. But man, thanks y'all so much for getting with it in the comments, and look forward to engaging with y'all on our previews.
God bless.
Thanks, y'all.